So I've actually just come back from a 2 week in India with Radhika, and this was kind of combination of political and family because Radhika Desai, my wife, was originally from India, but she left in 1984. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll try and speak up. I Wait a minute. Let me see if I can do something about the microphone. Audio settings. Is that any better?
Yeah, that's a higher volume, yes.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Yeah, sorry about that, but thanks for telling me. I just turned up the microphone volume. And it was most of it was political, although we spent some time meeting relatives, and we travelled over quite a disparate range of places in India. We started off with something that I think would be of interest to people here, and this was a kind of Keda camp, I suppose you'd call it, a 3-day event in Bangalore, which is in the south of India, which is organised twice yearly by the comrades there of the Fourth International in India. And particularly, I want to play tribute to Achin Vanaik. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's written some quite impressive stuff on India, and the way that they've organised it is not to put any particular line, but just every year what they do is they invite open forum where they bring along a lot of activists, very mainly young people, and then they have commentators on various aspects of politics. And I found the discussion was of a very high level and not at all what I would have expected, given my not wonderful relations with the Fourth International. In that, although Achin had a view of what was happening in Russia, which I do not share, that was not imposed. That was not imposed. There was a free and open discussion about everything. I mention this because I think you might find it useful to get in touch with him, but also because it shows that even in a country where there is a very repressive regime, I mean, there's a discussion around the character of the Modi regime, but I broadly agree with Radhika Desai's characterization that this is actually a fascist regime in all the senses that it organizes through a paramilitary. It's changing the constitution in such a way as to make repression and discrimination against Muslims and hierarchical authoritarian structure, the constitutional way they operate. There's widespread police repression, vigilante repression. In such a country, there is resistance, and it's very strong, and there's a new generation of people coming up. So I hope, because I felt the discussion we had last time ended on a somewhat pessimistic note, that's an encouraging note I could sound. And one of the things I picked up, which is relevant to this discussion, is this book, and this is by a man, I hope it's not mirrored, called M.N. Roy. And M.N. Roy was one of the foremost Indian Marxists. And I mention him because he contributed what I consider to be the best definition of imperialism to the communist movement. He prepared the document, a Theses on the Eastern Question, which was adopted at the Third Congress of the Third International. And I say this because I think his definition, which is a thoroughly Marxist definition, puts right a series of very serious misunderstandings about the nature of imperialism, which confuse two things. One, which is what Roy talks about, is what's the essence of imperialism? What's the real class nature of imperialism? That's Roy's focus. Then you have the debate, which everybody goes back to, between Lenin and Luxemburg about imperialism, which is not a debate, in my opinion, about the nature of imperialism, its essence, but how in history imperialism's got to the stage that it had reached before the First World War broke out, or when the First World War broke out. So it's not actually a discussion about the essence of imperialism, it's a discussion about the origins of imperialism. And therefore they talk about things that are going on at one particular point in history. So they say, but Rosa Luxemburg says, well, this is mainly because capitalism lacks markets abroad, lacks internal markets, so there's a demand problem, and therefore it has to conquer lands in order to provide markets for its surplus that it cannot consume domestically. Lenin focuses, and I tend to side with Lenin in this debate, on the monopoly stage of capitalism. And in this respect, I would recommend an excellent book. I think it's reached the stage of a book by an Australian scholar called Sam King. He's a Trotskyist by origin. And he takes issue with the way that much of the communist movement and the Trotskyist movement has interpreted Lenin by focusing on the export of capital. And he says the key point about Lenin's definition is it deals with the monopoly stage of capitalism, and what it does, what imperialism consists of is the maintenance of a monopoly of rights over the labour forces of other countries. But it's still a discussion of the origins, not the essence of it. So now I hope I'm going to be able to share my screen, and I'm going to start with Roy's definition of imperialism. So let me see what I can do. Share screen, application windows. I hope this one works. So can you guys see that? Yeah, you're muted, but unless somebody tells. Now, here's the problem, of course, it won't let me move the slides forward. Yes, it does. Okay. So Roy says, I think this is a definition. He talks about current stage of history, and he says the world is divided into two great colonial empires. The United States of America endeavors to assume exclusive right of exploiting the New World. So he's referring to the Americas. Great Britain has annexed practically the entire continents of Asia and Africa. Then he says again, the destruction of the monopolist right of exploitation in the Eastern colonial empire is a vital factor in the successful overthrow of the capitalist order. And I want you to note the word capitalist order. So Roy doesn't just say we should destroy imperialism because it's a bad thing. We should destroy it because that's the only way you can finally and successfully overthrow the capitalist order. So overthrowing imperialism is actually an anti-capitalist necessity. And this idea crops up many times, and I've written about it a lot in Marx's writings, where he basically says, as long as you're exploiting other nations, don't expect your own nation to become free. And this is something that in two respects is ignored by much of the contemporary discourse on imperialism, because on the one hand, it thinks that imperialism is about the conquest of territories. This is the whole Woodrow Wilson, the American notion of what imperialism is it's grabbing lands. But what the Marxist definition says, no, it's about getting rights over people, the people who live on the land. And that's one of the reasons that I think that imperialism is prepared to countenance they think nothing of proposing to export the whole Palestinian population of Gaza and the West Bank to another country. They don't care about the peoples, but the peoples is what imperialism is actually about, not the land. And I think you see the same thing with Trump's idea that he can solve the problems of the American economy by basically annexing Canada and Greenland. Now, this has caused a lot of ribaldry and mirth, but actually this idea has come up many times in American history. It's a perfectly serious proposal. I'm not saying it's going to fly, but it's not just Trump's idea. It's not just Trumpism. In fact, from the earliest days of the American empire, they wanted Canada, and even Sam Adams is not just a manufacturer of beer, but a famous founder of America, said, next step, Canada. So from the very beginning, they wanted Canada because Canada was the hideout of the loyalists. And the proposal to annex Greenland has come up many times. So the point is, this is, on the one hand, it is imperialist in character. It's an expansionist. You solve your problems by expanding into somebody else's territory. But it doesn't, there are 25,000 people in Greenland. There's not many people to exploit. And Canada is already an imperialist country. So you're not going to be able to exploit them in the same way that they exploit the people of Nicaragua or Mexico or Brazil, who live at a much lower living standard. So it's not actually a solution. But the interesting thing is, the dog returns to its mess, that they keep coming up with the only notion they have of how to solve their problems is by expanding. And it's crucial to realize that's a monopolist conception, because you can't have every country in the world solving its problems by annexing everybody else's territory. It's only one country can do it, and that's America. So the American leadership, including above all Trump, but also Biden, have this notion of the kind of, the unique special character of America, that it has the sole right to do things which other nations can't do. And that's a monopoly right. So what is that monopoly right? That monopoly right is to exploit the labor of other people. And I want to stress how central this is. I mentioned it in my last talk, but I'm going to show you that the rate at which the labor of Indian workers exchanges for the labor of American workers is somewhere between 20 to 1 and 40 to 1. That means you can hire, basically, via the market, you can get the labor of 20 Indian workers for what it would cost you to get the labor of one American worker. So obviously, you're going to be able to get a huge amount more surplus value via imperialism than that which you'll get by exploiting your own workers. And so what I'm saying is the character of the imperialist states is primarily and fundamentally to extract the labor of workers in the 4/5 of the world that are not imperialist, to resolve the conflicts that they would have with their own workers if they were not able to do it. What's happening now is, as a result of multipolarity, as a result of the development of China, and as a result of the development of Russia, which I'll say a few words about, it's no longer possible to solve the problems of your conflicts, your domestic conflicts with your own workers, by the methods of expanding into other parts of the world. And that's what's behind the crisis of America right now. When I use the word America, I apologize to everybody in Latin America. I'm using it as a shorthand. I'll try and say the USA whenever I can to distinguish Anglo-America from the other parts of America. Now I'm going to show you a few graphs, and I hope they don't deter you too much. But please stop me if there's something you don't understand, because, okay, we can have questions and discussion afterwards. But if I'm saying something that doesn't make sense to you, just stop me and say, hang on, could you explain this? Wave a hand or use the reaction or something like that. Now, this is a crucial chart. I just want to explain what it is and then what it tells you. There is a text down the side which also explains it. What you do is you take the GDP per capita of one group of countries, in this case, the North, the global North, or what I'm calling the Columbian nations, the imperialist nations. You take their GDP per capita. Then you take the GDP capita of everybody else except China and Russia. That is the global South. Now, the reason I'm leaving out China is precisely because it doesn't behave like the rest of the South. So if you lump it in with the South, you'll get a confused and wrong picture. The reason I'm leaving out Russia is slightly different. It's very difficult to get comparable statistics for Russia because statisticians disagree about how you translate what was happening before the fall of the Soviet Union into comparable terms. So I'm going to put Russia out just for statistical reasons. So it's just the global South. It's about 3/5 of the world. Now, that's a measure of inequality. It's a measure of how much your GDP per capita is bigger or smaller. Inequality is getting worse. It should be one. If nations were equal, it should be one. They should be the same. GDP per capita here should be the same as in India. GDP per capita in the USA should be the same as in, Africa, which it certainly isn't. Now, the most important thing is just after the Second World War, 1954, thereabouts, this was about 6 or 7 times, which is bad. Actually, that's at least just as bad as it was in Lenin's time. In Lenin's time, it was about 5, 6, 7 times, right? There's lots of data that prove this, not in the same way, but it's a good approximation. That then starts going up, and it goes up until the 1970s. The first thing to say is that should not have happened according to neoclassical economics. So everything that these guys believe tells them this isn't happening, and they ignore it. They find all sorts of funky ways to fiddle the statistics to pretend that this isn't happening. Then what you have is a plateau in the 1970s. That was when you had developmentalism. That was when you had the dependency school, you had import substitution, you had protection of the economies of many countries in the world. You had the anti-colonial movement, places, the African empire was being dismantled. It was just after India started to get underway after colonial independence. So the advantage that the North was getting stops going up. And around about 1978, they enter a crisis. We all know that there was a great slump in 1974. Ernest Mandel predicted it. He wrote an excellent book about it called The Second Slump, which I can thoroughly recommend as reading material if you want to study this. And they had a fork in the road. They could have gone the way of the Brandt Commission, reopen relations with Russia, transform their economies to more socially conscious and more control over capital than before. They didn't. They went the way of neoliberalism. Now, in the sort of canon of the North, neoliberalism is an attack on the working class of the North. So it's Thatcher. We think of it as Thatcherism and Reaganism, right? But actually, it was that, but it was much more an attack on the South. You had the debt crisis. You had the IMF saying, "We will tell you how to fix your economies in order that we will lend you money." And they had, mass privatization, structural adjustment. And the result was that inequality doubled in 15 years. So the effect of opening the market was to massively increase inequality between nations. If you then look at the next jump, that's the dissolution of the USSR. So by the time you get to 1999, you have the unipolar moment. You have inequality is at an all-time high of 22 times higher for the global South as average, which means since that's an average, a lot of countries are a lot worse off. Africa, Bangladesh, the poorest countries in the world are even worse off than that. And then what happens is it starts to get better. Now, I'm going to come back to this, but it's an important question as to why it gets better and how much it can get better. It stops getting better around about 2012. That may change. I'm not betting that will continue. I think the BRICS and the rise of China will both act as a restraining force. So that text is all there on the left-hand side of that. So essentially the point I'm making here is the market brings that about. Now, everybody thinks of imperialism as something that is to do with the conquest of territories. But neocolonialism, which was pioneered by the Americans, by the way, at the turn of the last century, one of the reasons I argue that imperialism actually originated in America is they pioneered the modern model of imperialism, which is not the rather semi-feudal method of sending a bunch of armies and declaring the Queen of England to be the Queen of the Empress of India. It's done by the market. The market does it for you. This is all happening via the market. So imperialism is actually using the market to maintain a permanent monopoly of your own producers. And I'll come on to this thing on the USSR in a minute. But the point is, the way that monopoly works is basically quite straightforward. The North maintains, or the Colombian countries maintain a monopoly of the production of high-tech goods, and they force the countries of the south to produce primary commodities, minerals, and anything that is produced by cheap labor. So they use them as a hinterland to get all the things that their own economies depend on, but they have massively unfair terms of exchange. It's called unequal exchange. Now, I have no idea why. Well, I have some idea why, but the term unequal exchange used to be quite well developed under people like Samir Amin and Ernest Mandel as well, and then vanished, and now nobody talks about it. But it, just because people don't talk about it doesn't mean it's not happening. And it is the major way that the market realizes the capacity of the imperialist countries to exploit the labor of the rest of the world. Looking at the effect on the USSR, I'm throwing this in both to illustrate how terrible was the dissolution of the USSR for the people of the USSR. This is not the same inequality index. This is the growth rate. This is the GDP, simple GDP per capita. I had to measure it in something called PPPs because I couldn't get any other data. But basically, it's the ratio, it's the upside down ratio of the same thing. Sorry not to explain this at more length, but I'm not making big use of this. But the key point is that if you look at 1984, the GDP per capita of the Soviet Union was about level with that of the global north. That's what that 0.9 means. If that was 1, that would be equal. Then it collapsed. It did begin collapsing before the collapse of the Soviet Union, and there's big discussions and arguments about what caused that. But the point is that once you had the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which is in 1987, now I don't know if you can see my mouse, that's the dissolution of the Soviet Union. It was going down, but not by much. Then it absolutely collapsed, and it collapsed close to the level of the global south. In other words, the USSR and all its constituent parts were reduced basically to the level of the colonial world, which I think was a tremendous shock for Russia. It was the last thing expected, and therefore that's accounted for the rise in Putinism. It's what's given rise to the special military operation, the war in Ukraine. They had to respond to that. They had no choice, because the next thing that the imperialists wanted to do was carve Russia up into pieces. And I therefore think that that was a preemptive move of self-defense, the war. I make no excuses for that whatsoever. The exception that proves the rule is China. Now we're back to the same measure of inequality. By 1990, China was 60 times worse off than the rest of the Colombian nations. I don't think that that was a sign of the any failure of communism. It's because the monetary figures don't have as much relevance for China as they do for the South, because China didn't have an open economy. It wasn't basically engaged in massive trading with the North. Once it started trading, it was actually able, by a model of running its economy, to take the technology, to share the technology, the to break the high tech monopoly of the United States. And so the inequality between China and the Colombian nations goes down and down and down. It's now back to 5, and that was 2015. It's probably even lower. It's the level of a high income, a middle income country now, which is an extraordinary achievement. No other country in the world has ever achieved anything like this in any sort of space of time. And I think the last nail in the coffin is this. I don't know if you've been following this deep seek invention, but for $6 million, the Chinese have created something which have crashed the entire US market in high-tech stocks. And the most interesting thing about that is there's no way that Trump can claim this is because China stole that technology from the US. This is the language he's been using to justify his tariff war against China. But the Chinese did this on their own. They didn't steal anything from America. To the contrary, what America should now be doing, what the USA should now be doing, is saying, please give us this technology and let's work together. But they're not going to do that. I won't go into this one. It just shows, this graph just shows, it's in the article that I wrote in a journal called Development and Change. If people who are watching this want to follow up. And it just shows the vast bulk of natural inequality between nations is caused by inequality between the North and the South. And the neoclassical economists, the apologists of imperialism, completely ignore that. They take no account of inter-block differences. And that's what this chart shows. Okay, quickly now on the mechanism of this. This is a chart showing the real growth advantage of the global South, the world majority, as the Valdai Club people call the world majority over the Colombian nations. And since basically 2001 in particular, the South has actually been growing 4% faster than the North. So if it's growing faster, why isn't it making any money? And the answer is because it's producing more and more, and the price is collapsing. In India, this is so tragically clear. Punjab, we spent some time in Punjab, which was at one stage the center of what was called the Green Revolution in India, the massive expansion of significant expansion of productivity by new irrigation methods, by the use of fertilizers, artificial chemical fertilization, which is not wrong in itself, but it made them dependent on the high-tech industries of America, which were providing with those chemicals, and it made them also, this is GM is starting to come in, they're then dependent on the USA for the seed. So all the inputs to agriculture come from abroad. The price of land is rising, and agricultural income collapses because they're producing so much agricultural products that the price collapses. It's no use to you producing more and more if you produce twice as much and the price goes down by 1/3, you're 50% worse off. And that's what's actually happening. But because it happens, that's unequal exchange. Because it happens through the market, it seems to be natural. Seems to be natural. So this leads to hubris and imperial superiority complex. They think they are rich because they're superior. Trump is the classic manifestation of this. We're the great, the wonderful American people, make America great again. But America has never been great. The only thing it's been great at is robbery, which is turned into the perfect art because it invented neocolonialism. So actually they mistake robbery for superiority, which leads to the racism and all that stuff. However, Nemesis is coming. This is a chart of the GDP growth rate of the whole of the North. So that's America, USA, settler colonies, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and Europe. Put them all together. That's what's happening to their growth rate, and it has systematically declined since 1957. You can see it goes up and down, but it goes down, and it's now at its lowest rate ever. You can see it declined to 0% in the crash of 2011. I think it's now meandering around 1%. It's basically completely stagnant. And this is recognized in the IMF literature. They speak of stagnant growth and all that kind of stuff. It's recognized. But the point that's not recognized, because they don't study long-term trends, that this has been going down since after the Second World War. There was a huge boost after the Second World War, for reasons we'll look at, because the USA turned to wartime production, turned to planning. The state took control of capital growth, and they then gave it all back free to the capitalists after the wars. So they massively restored the rate of profit. If you want to know why this happened, my explanation is very simple. I can sum it up very bluntly. It's the rate of profit dummy. This is Marx's explanation of these long declines in output and in the relative return to capital, is that it's caused by the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. I'm not saying that's the only factor at work in the crisis of the USA. There's a couple more that we need to look at. But I want to look at the crisis of imperialism as a whole, and the only explanation for the crisis of imperialism as a whole, as opposed to the specifics of the USA, is the falling rate of profit. And that's been, excoriated and ignored, and everybody says it's completely stupid, including most of the Marxists. But as Galileo said, it still moves. It's happening. So that the rate of return on capital of the USA has been going down, and that's an average rate, which includes both industrial capital, productive capital, but also all forms of what I call parasitic capital. It includes banking. So what happens when the rate of profit declines, particularly in the USA and also in the UK, but in the other countries, is people stop investing in production. They start investing in financial assets. So a greater and greater proportion of the profits of the capitalists do not go into rebuilding the economy or improving the economy or raising productivity or any of the things that capitalism is famous for. They go into banking, they go into finance. And I certainly saw this in India, where I met many people who said, well, Modi is absolutely wonderful because he introduced the universal payment system, the Indian finance is doing great. Then there's this magic recovery of Indian IT, and I asked people, I said, who uses the IT? It turns out the main users of Indian IT are the banks. So go figure, because all finance does is moves money from one place to the other. Chiefly, it moves it from the very poor to the very rich, and the scale of opulence amongst the elites in India, which are a tiny minority, are absolutely staggering. Absolutely staggering. I'm sure Trump can rival them and so on, but. When you look at the condition of the majority of the people of India, it's a huge scandal. I probably won't be let back into India for saying that, but anyway, there you go. Now, this is not just a US phenomenon. This chart here, I'm nearly at the end, but all this background is very important. The facts must be the basis on which we decide. The grey lines, no, the dark grey lines show the rate of GDP growth of these countries up until 1974. And the light grey ones show after 1974, so after the Great Crash. So what you have beforehand is many countries were catching up. You can see Japan, for example, was expanding at this astonishing rate of 8% until 1974. Spain was actually expanding. Portugal, Germany was expanding. Italy, you had the German miracle. Lagging behind on the left-hand end of the thing, you have the UK, who's basically it's just bumbling along at 2% the whole time, which is why it's in such a mess now. So the crucial thing is, once this spurt of growth is over, everything becomes more or less the same. If you think of a line going across these countries here, the average growth, not only is the average growth rate of the North 2%, but very few countries are above 2%. The best is Australia at 3%. The rest are in a band between 2.8 and, let's say, the worst would be Italy. They're not better at football, but anyway, 1.5%. So, this is not just a US phenomenon. This is an imperialist phenomenon, and they're all in it together. And that's one of the reasons they're starting to fall out amongst each other, because they're battling with each other. These problems are of the USA's making. In other words, there's a general decline of the North, but there's a specific decline of the USA. And the specific decline of the USA, which makes it worse than any of the others, is this massive concentration of effort of focus on military and financial expenditure and a vastly bloated intelligence apparatus. I think there are 47 different intelligence agencies in the USA. I read somewhere, but don't quote me on that. And I did a calculation for some Chinese friends in which I asked, what would have happened if the North simply kept growing as fast as in 1970? And basically, its share of world growth would have been more or less the same, wouldn't have changed. That the black line in the middle is what the USA's share of growth would have been. But it didn't. It slowed down. So you have this massive contraction of the USA's share in growth, which is caused by the USA. It's what I call, it's got two legs of a tripod. It rests on its productive advantage, its military advantage, and its financial advantage, and it can't keep all of them up together. So what's happening is, because it's prioritized the financial advantage and the military advantage, it's failing to develop its own productive economy. And so it's got the double whammy. It's the concentration on the military expansion, on the huge cost of American finance, and it's the falling rate of profit. So it's in a big mess. So now to kind of open up the discussion, this was a session I did on Lenin. Why don't the imperialists have a stop button? Well, they seem to have found a stop button called Donald Trump, and let's see what happens. I wrote this before we knew that Donald Trump was going to win. But the second great puzzle is why the left doesn't resist. And those are the two great puzzles of the answer is very simple, but I'm not going to give it unless you ask me to at this point. I'm going to stop my contribution here and say that what we've got to ask is, even despite all these crises, even despite the failure of imperialism, why don't they have a stop button? Why do they just carry on? And in particular, why doesn't the left, the Social Democratic parties, the Democratic Party, are actually the worst? So why is that? And I think if we can answer that question, we can lay the basis for a different understanding of imperialism, which I hope will be the answer that the young people who are coming up in all countries of the world in response to what's happening in Palestine and and the Ukraine war now, which I hope them allow to get a new and better focus on the causes of the problems and what the solutions are. So I'll stop at that point. Thank you for your patience.